Hey guys, and welcome to another Oath of the Gatewatch limited review video. Today I'm looking at the top 10 bad cards to avoid. The criteria for this list is generally cards that sort of look like they might have some promise, but I think are generally not worth playing in your deck, barring some very special conditions, and I'll talk about those conditions. Some of this is based on like past experience where I've seen players play certain cards over and over again that usually aren't very good for them, and usually I end up doing well against players who play those cards, and some of it's also just based on my own evaluation of cards. And so, yeah, we'll go ahead and get into the list. At number 10, I have Elemental Uprising, and I kind of have this card on the list because I myself was overrating it, in part because I misread it. I thought that it let one of your creatures become a 4/4 elemental creature with haste until end of turn, and made it so that it had the lure ability, which meant that all of your opponent's creatures had to block it. Instead, what it has is that one of your opponent's creatures has to block it. So, I think people are looking at this card somewhat as a green removal spell, and it's another disappointing one if that's what you think, if that's what you want to use it for, because, you basically end up paying 3 mana because you have to use your land to attack, and you end up your opponent most of the time can just give up whatever their worst creature is, and sometimes, they can even just, if you're trying to kill anything with 4 power or more, you end up just getting 2 for 1. You end up losing your land, you end up losing your Elemental Uprising, your opponent loses 1 card. Most of the time, if my opponent wants to cast Elemental Uprising and we're at parity, and I have a 4 power creature in play, unless it's an incredible creature, I'm going to be willing to make that trade because it's a 2 for 1. And this card does have a little bit of utility as a combat trick of sorts, where you get to be the one to decide to make your guy into a 4/4 and block one of your opponent's smaller creatures. But even then, you open yourself up to another easy 2-1 unless your opponent's tapped out, because they could just use a removal spell on your Elemental Uprising. And I mean, in a best case scenario, it's a combat trick against a small creature, and it's an okay one. But I think the problem is that a lot of people are going to see this as more of an aggressive card to sort of kill one of your opponent's creatures. But the fact is, most of the time, it's going to end up not, delivering on that promise. And in the end, I don't think it'll be very good. I will admit this card is hard to evaluate because it's sort of a new kind of card. I mean, we've had cards that turn lands on. We've had cards that force creatures to be blocked. Having both together at instant speed is a little interesting. So I add the caveat that I could indeed be wrong about this card, but I definitely can see people overrating it and thinking it's better than it is, when I think most of the time you don't even want it in your deck. All right, on to number 9. I kind of cheated here. I did just all the common and uncommon equipment. I constantly see people play equipment in every set, no matter what set it is. Most of the time it's a bad idea. Wizards of the Coast, back in the day when they invented equipment in Mirrodin block, printed way too much powerful equipment. All of it's like way too easy to cast and way too easy to equip. And now I feel like they're trying really hard not to do that again, at least at common and uncommon. I will say the 2 rare equipment in this set are perfectly playable, especially in an ally deck. But, you can look at those for yourself. But these 3 here are not especially good. I think Bonesaw is going to be the one that most people try to cram into their deck because it costs 0 and its equip cost is 1. But the bonus it grants is not very significant. And I can also see people cramming it into their deck because they want to use it with cards that have Surge. Those cards in the set that say, if you cast another spell this turn, or a teammate did, you may play this card for its Surge cost. Bonesaw turns on your Surge, and that's great. But I think Bonesaw is only good if you end up with a huge number of Surge cards, and most of the time I don't think you want to, because those cards are only, they do sort of pigeonhole you. They're not always going to be able to be cast for that good Surge cost. Most of the time, in fact, I think they're going to have to be cast for their other cost. So I don't think Bonesaw is that good. Chitinous Cloak and Strider Harness are kind of more what you expect from the more recent equipment. They cost too much to play and I think too much to equip. Strider Harness at least only costs 1 to equip in the end, so it can give your creatures haste over and over again for only 1 additional mana. Not too bad. The bonus is also good. But I think the fact that initially you have to pay 3 mana for no effect on the board is bad. Same with Chitinous Cloak, and Chitinous Cloak definitely costs way too much to equip. I do think Strider Harness of these is the best of them. And if I'm going to be wrong about one of them, it'll be Strider Harness, I think. The other 2, I think, are basically junk, and I don't think they just shouldn't be played. Again, I guess Bonesaw has an exception where, you end up with all the best cards that have surge, and you want to make sure you can turn them on all the time, then maybe it's okay. But still, I don't know if it's worth it. There's also just not enough equipment synergy in this set, even though Wizard seems to have tried a little bit to warrant playing any of these 3 pieces of equipment most of the time. All right, so number 8, also cheated a little bit, I'll say, but it's because I see players constantly play auras that shouldn't be played. And I'll explain why your average aura, like these two, and I should say offensive auras you put on your own creature, shouldn't be played. And the reason they shouldn't be played is because they easily open you up to 2-for-1s. Your opponent can, in response to you casting one of them, use removal. You can also wait till you attack and then use removal, and then you just got easily 2-for-1. There's lots of efficient removal in this set, much of it at instant speed. Doesn't even really need to be at instant speed, though, to 2-for-1 you when you put an aura on something. You may get one swing in or something, and then your opponent deals with it on their turn. It is better at instant speed, of course, against auras. The only auras that I find that are fairly playable are the kind that replace themselves or grant an effect so powerful that it's worth the risk. A recent-ish example of that would be in Magic 2015, Spectra Ward, which gave your creature +2/+2 and protection from all colors. So obviously, that protects your aura, that makes your creature bigger, and your creature is going to be pretty difficult to deal with. Neither of these cards sort of fit in that category. They don't replace themselves. More recently, we had, I can't remember the name of the card, but one in a blue mana. It was in Magic Origins. It was a reprint. Enchanted creature has flying and can block only creatures with flying, draw a card. An effect like that, giving a creature flying and getting to draw a card is great. You can still open yourself up to a 2-for-1 with a card like that, of course, because your opponent can at instant speed remove things. But you can sort of wait to play it until your opponent's tapped out, or they don't have removal because of the mana they're leaving up. And these two, neither of them grant powerful enough effects. I will say though that auras, I do find myself occasionally siding in against opponents who seem to have absolutely no removal, because then you lose as having as big of a risk of getting 2-for-1. And then these effects are quite powerful because you're not going to get easily 2-for-1 and sort of lose the card battle because your opponent just has more cards that do something than you do at a certain point in the game. All right, at number 7, I have Hedron Crawler. There are a lot of way better sources of colorless mana one can find in Oath of the Gatewatch and in Battle for Zendikar, for that matter, than Hedron Crawler. Hedron Crawler is a 2-mana 0/1, which basically means it's insignificant. It can occasionally chump block something, and that matters, I guess. But most of the time, you're going to want to be tapping its ad mana anyway. And if that's the case, I think you would basically rather just have a waste that you never had to invest mana in, or any other land that produces colorless mana, or a creature that comes into play with a significant body and puts an Eldrazi Scion into play, which produces colorless mana. There may be a strange situation where you're desperate for colorless mana, some of your best cards in your deck need it, and Hedron Crawler is still floating around in your second pack, and you're not going to see more of them because the third pack's Battle for Zendikar. And then maybe you play a Hedron Crawler, but I don't think you're ever going to be happy about it. I don't think you should play this most of the time. I think people are going to want to. They're going to overvalue the fact that it can produce this colorless mana. I mean, it can also help you ramp a little bit, but it's easy to deal with for your opponent, and it's just an insignificant body, and there's just way better sources you could use than Hedron Crawler. At number 6, I have Reaver Drone. This card is the kind of card that I see people overplay fairly regularly, I would say, because it's a card that would be really good and constructed in a deck where, in a format where games are much faster, and you can have 4 of these in your deck, so your chances of getting a couple of them in a game are much higher. The problem is you're probably not going to get 4 of these. It could happen, I guess. But even if you do, I don't think you want to play all 4 of them. It's a 1-mana 2/1 with a minor downside, and that's nice, but 1-mana 2/1s, 1 mana, even 1-mana 2/2s in limited often aren't that good. I mean, the games are slower than they are in constructed, and you quickly end up in a situation where your 2/1 can't even attack, and it's probably never going to attack again. It may as well not even be on the battlefield. Your opponent doesn't even care that it exists, and they don't need to be concerned about it. And there's no sort of synergies in the set that make you want to play Reaver Drone. There's nothing that, pays off a lot, at least in black, for going really wide. So having a lot of these low mana creatures isn't great. And so most of the time, I just don't think you want Reaver Drone. It's a card that just will have it's an awful late game top deck. That's something to think about with a lot of these cards, as most of them are. And it's the only time it's ever good is if you actually play it on turn 1 and maybe on turn 2. After that, it just becomes basically a useless card, and it may even be doing 1 damage to you a turn if your opponent's using their removal to take out your colorless creatures. So you don't really want that to be happening. All right, at number 5, I have Stoneforge Acolyte. You know I'm not super high on any of the equipment in the set that's not rare. So obviously one of these core artificer allies they printed who does something with equipment I'm not especially high on. This one I'm even less high on than the rare one, because the rare one at least is a 2-mana 2/2, which is a little better. It's better than a 1-mana 1/2. And it's, you know, they're both allies, so they have that going for them. But the other one can also generate card advantage, and it just has a more powerful effect. Stoneforge Acolyte, its effect is going to be pretty irrelevant in a limited game, mostly because you're not going to want that much equipment in your deck. So it's cohort effect, which lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library, and then you get to reveal an equipment if you happen to see one and put it in your hand. I mean, yeah, drawing a card's great, but first of all, this thing wants another ally in play to make it work. You have to tap down it and another ally to make it work, which is fine for some of the more powerful or, you know, even just average cohort effects. But with this one, you could whiff a lot of the time, and you will be if you're playing what I think is the more correct number of equipment in your deck, which is like none unless it's rare, basically. I guess in a weird situation where you end up with 2 of both of those rare equipments, and, you know, then you're in an ally deck, which is where those are at their best, then I probably would play Stoneforge Acolyte, but you'd have to have, you know, at least 4 pieces of equipment before the Acolyte becomes worth playing, I think, and there just aren't enough of them running around that are super playable. So I'm not a huge fan of the card. I would definitely advise against playing it. I know seeing a 1-mana 1/2 is like, hey, well, it passes the vanilla test, but again, like the previous card, it quickly becomes irrelevant, even more quickly, actually, because it can't even block well the way, at least the other card can do a little bit of blocking against creatures with 2 toughness. All right, on to number 4. On number 4, we have Consuming Sinkhole. This is a card that is basically a mini lava axe, or a way of removing a land creature from play, and it lets you exile it. This card is definitely a solid sideboard card. I will say that. I mean, it's not as much of a lost cause as I think most of the cards on this list. It's a card I'd be happy to cite in a lot of the time. But the fact is, against a lot of opponents, it's never going to do anything except the Lava Axe mode. And in a format as slow as this one, an effect like Lava Axe isn't what you really want. You don't want a card that affects the board, not at all, and just reduces your opponent's life total. I mean, it is nice to know, like, let's say your opponent's at 4, and you're like, man, if I just draw my Consuming Sinkhole, but that's like an ideal situation. Like, if you and your opponent are at parity, or they're a little bit ahead of you, and they're still at like 20, and you draw your Consuming Sinkhole, unless they have a land creature in play, you're not going to be very happy. However, against opponents who show you a few Awaken cards, or the couple landfall creatures that are in the format that turn lands into creatures, or anything else that turns lands into creatures, man lands, then Consuming Sinkhole becomes a legitimately good sideboard card, I think, because then you have a choice between the mini Lava Axe effect that'll do 4 and exiling a land creature, which is a relevant effect, I think. So it's again, I think this card is worth picking up if you need something to put in your sideboard, but it's not a card to prioritize, and I wouldn't take it over very many things in the format. So on to number 3, I have Abstruse Interference. This is the kind of card like I looked at and I got excited about, and I wanted to be excited about it, but the more I thought about it, it's just not good enough, basically. I mean, it's a 3-mana, 4-spike. 4-spike's a really old card that costs 1 blue. They counter a spell unless an opponent pays 1. Just, add that to the glossary, I guess. But it puts a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion creature token on the battlefield as well. So it's like, man, if I can counter their spell and get a Scion, I am really happy. And that is kind of nice. At least if this counter spell fails, which it will like 99% of the time, you do get something out of it no matter what. But you're paying 3 for a 1/1 Scion when you can easily be paying 3 for a creature with a decent body in a 1/1 Scion. So the problem with counterspells like this one is that your opponent has to be playing something exactly on curve, or your Abstruse Interference isn't going to do anything other than give you a Scion. Again, it does something at least unlike some of these other more recent counterspells, it does something even if it fails. But it doesn't do much. It doesn't do enough. As exciting as the ideal case for this card where you counter their spell and you get a Scion is, that's just not going to happen often enough to warrant playing Abstruse Interference in your deck. So I would definitely advise against it. At number 2 is sort of a similar thing, Pyromancer's Assault. It was a card I saw, I got excited about. I wanted to find a way to build a limited deck that would be good with it, but I just don't think there's really a way. It does at least hit creatures or players, which is nice. Sometimes these effects don't do that. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Molten Nursery, a card that we just saw in Battle for Zendikar. Had a lot of promise. Pinged a player or a creature every time you played a colorless spell, but it's just not worth the investment. Pyromancer's Assault costs 1 more. You're paying 4, probably not impacting the board at all the turn you play it. And then eventually, if you manage to play 2 spells in a turn, you do get to do 2 damage to a creature or a player. I mean, I could see you, if you play this on turn 4 every game, getting 2 to 3 triggers out of this, which sounds pretty good. And it is pretty good if you can do that consistently, if you can play it on turn 4 consistently. But it's an awful late game top deck. It's not really a very good mid game top deck. It's a card you want to be playing on turn 4 every game. It is a card that I would be interested in trying to make a constructed deck with, certainly, but it's not in limited. I just don't think it's going to be good enough. The other problem with it is it encourages people to play bone saws, which I don't think they should be doing either. So yeah, if you ended up with a deck with ways to draw extra cards and lots of bone saws, and Pyromancer's Assault would be awesome. But that's the other problem. There aren't enough ways to efficiently draw a lot of cards in this format. So it's hard to trigger this more than a few times a game if you play it on turn 4. If you play it later, you're probably not even going to trigger it a few times. And if you are trying really hard to trigger it, you're slowing down your tempo more on the board, your position on the board more, just to do 2 damage, which most of the time won't be worth it. So I think this is a card that I can see people overrating because it can actually take out your opponent's cards, it can do damage to them, and it seems like it can do a lot, but I think most of the time it's just going to end up being a dud, the same way Molten Nursery did end up being 99.9% of the time. Right, at number 1, I have Ruin in Their Wake. This is a card that has really cool flavor design that I think is very interesting, and it may even end up making an impact in Constructed. Unfortunately, limited, I don't think it's very good. It's basically a worse Sylvan Scrying most of the time, and Sylvan Scrying, which you just had in Battle for Zendikar, was unplayable 99.9% of the time as well. This lets you search your library for a basic land card and reveal it, and then if you control a basic land or a land named Wastes, you can put that card on the battlefield tapped. So it's a conditional rampant growth. Like, if you have a Wastes in play, you can put another land, you can put whatever land you search for, basic, by the way, so Sylvan Scrying can search for any land, including non-basics. This can only get basics, and you put it into play tapped if you have Wastes. Now, I will say that if you end up in some weird deck that's, a couple colors, but most of your creatures are colorless, and you can afford to play and you manage to draft, by the way, 6 or 7 Wastes, then Ruin in Their Wake might be worth it. But the problem with it is, unlike Rampant Growth, which you can always cast in turn 2, Ruin in Their Wake, you can cast this in turn 2 as well, but most of the time it's not going to be worth it. Ruin in Their Wake won't help you ramp the way Rampant Growth will on turn 2. Ruin in Their Wake will just search you out of land and maybe help you fix, which isn't terrible, but again, Sylvan Scrying, not a card that ever sees a whole lot of limited play, and this is a worse Sylvan Scrying because at least the Scrying can get you important non-basics. So it's just not going to ramp you early enough to be relevant. In the later game, maybe it lets you put a land into play tapped, and maybe that matters. And there will, as I said, I think occasionally someone will end up drafting a deck where Ruin in Their Wake is amazing. But it's just not going to happen often enough. There aren't enough Wastes to go around, I don't think, for you. And you don't want to be prioritizing them for a card like Ruin in Their Wake. Well, let's say if you opened up the big Eldrazi Mythic Rare guy who costs 10 in your first pack, and you end up building a deck that does end up with a lot of Wastes, then Ruin in Their Wake might be something you want. But that's really the only, and it's a very specific case where I think it's playable. Anyway, those are my top 10 cards, bad cards I think you should avoid that people might be inclined to play, people might be overrating a little bit. Let me know if you think there's anything I missed. Let me know if you think I'm down on a card that I shouldn't be down on. Those kinds of discussions are welcome for everyone involved, including myself. I may be thinking about some of these cards incorrectly, and it's entirely possible. So I like to hear discussion about them. So let me know about that in the comments or on Twitter. Anyway, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.